I'm endlessly fascinated and curious about the world around us, about business, about politics, about the arts, about culture, developments, social issues, and the people. Most importantly, about the people that are shaping our future. Every night, I get the opportunity to have conversations, to dive into conversations with thought leaders, with change makers, entrepreneurs, politicians, and everyday heroes who unpack the ideas and stories that I think matter to all of us. What's the future of our economy? What's the future of our country? How do we build stronger communities? What can we learn from music, theater, sports, politics, the arts? How does policy shape our real lives? What does leadership look like, real leadership in today's environment? If it's interesting and relevant and topical and we're talking about it, you'll hear about it here at 6 o'clock on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I want to have real conversations, in-depth conversations. These are ideas we're sharing. This is the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Thanks for joining me. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Dominic Cardy with us tonight. He's written a really fascinating article about immigration and the challenges that we've got and what he thinks we need to do. He has got a really interesting background and present. He is the leader of a brand new party that's been launched in Canada in the radical center. And I'm going to let him explain that a little bit. But also he is a former Minister of Education in New Brunswick. And he's been very involved in politics for a long period of time. He's got some interesting points of view of where our politics is going. Dominic Cardy, welcome to the show.
Brian, thank you so much for having me on. Appreciate the time to chat.
So I want to talk a little bit about your new party, but let's start out with immigration if we could. Tell me, this article that you wrote this week was pretty hard-hitting about the challenges with our immigration system. Tell me why you were motivated to write this article, sir.
Well, it's something that I think we can see around the world, that immigration is ripping a lot of democracies apart because there was, I think, an unjustified assumption by a lot of governments that you could just kind of open the doors and we'd continue to get the benefits of immigration, which Canada is a nation of immigrants. I'm an immigrant. I was born in the UK. Immigration is a positive thing that makes your country stronger. Uncontrolled immigration, where the public aren't on board with what you're doing, is a disaster and should be the thing that people who support immigration are opposed to the most. Because if you can't integrate people into the country to which they're moving, then you are always going to have problems. And the bizarre thing we've done in Canada is after decades of having a really pretty well-run system where we took nearly all the politics out of our immigration system. And that was largely following a scandal back around the time that Hong Kong came under Chinese rule, and we had some programs there that were abused politically to get people who wanted to, for good reasons, to escape communist China. But that led to, in the best spirit of democracies, reform. And for the last couple of decades, the only areas where politicians have been able to really easily muck around with the immigration system has been the international student programs and the temporary foreign worker programs. And muck around with them, the Liberals did. Justin Trudeau's government blew the doors off one of the world's best, most well-managed immigration systems and has now turned Canada into yet another country where we are fighting for good reasons about immigration, because we've seen an enormous increase in our population. The vast majority of the folks who have come from two countries, from India and from Nigeria. The number of jobs that they are able to take has been expanded. And these are folks who do not go through the rigorous vetting process that we put all immigrants who want to Canada go through. And sometimes that problem has its flaws and its weaknesses and its failures. But to just open the doors and allow in millions, and I'm talking millions of people here, millions of folks came into the country without proper security vetting and have now been able to access an ever-growing number of jobs that were never part of the temporary foreign worker program, that were never covered under the international student programs. So we're now facing, despite the absolutely positive efforts that the Carney government has made to start to control the numbers coming in, the reality is that next year we are going to have hundreds of thousands of people living in this country who are going to lose their legal right to be here. We're going to be facing issues around deportations, around people going underground, around people becoming vulnerable to organized crime. Because if you want to stay in a better country, and Canada is the best country in the world, you want to stay here, a lot of people are willing, unfortunately, to break the law to stay here. So we have created this crazy system where we blew up one of the best managed systems in the world. And we replaced it with a system that is pushed hard by shady fly-by-night businesses who make money off the hopes and dreams of people living in developing countries, who are sold a bill of goods about what they're going to get when they come to Canada, and Canada is left to pick up those pieces. This is going to happen next year. These fights, these challenges are going to face us. And I have not heard anything from the Carney government, or for that matter, from the Poilievre Conservatives about how they're going to handle this. Because we've got to keep our immigration system solid. We've got to make sure it works. And when it comes to our temporary foreign workers program, we've got to make sure that some of those folks are able to stay here. A lot of those people work in our medical systems. I don't talk to many Canadians who say, what we really need in our healthcare system in Canada is to get rid of some of the staff. But at the same time, the program clearly needs to be reformed. So when Mr. Carney says the program just needs to be tweaked a bit, that's nonsense. It needs to be pared back radically and return to its original vision with some tweaks for 2025. And when the Conservatives say that it needs to be abolished, that's just not nonsense. That's criminal, because that's talking about decimating our healthcare system, destroying our agricultural sector, and cutting a hole in our retail sector, where, as much as I have sympathy for the many young Canadians who are now seeing a skyrocketing unemployment rate because they can't get that first job because businesses are going for lower cost foreign alternatives, you can't just make that switch happen overnight. We've got to be grown-ups here and stop this populist nonsense from left and right, pretending either problems don't exist or that the only solution to problems is to blow things up. We need some sensible reforms. And my party's laid some of those out, and I hope we get a chance to chat about those a little bit in this conversation.
I look forward to it. So let's take a big step back if we could. You've described that this immigration system, particularly temporary foreign workers, has changed dramatically in the last couple of years, where we brought in a whole bunch of people. You said, I hadn't heard this before, primarily from India and Nigeria. How and why did it change so dramatically?
It changed dramatically because of, and this is something else that we don't talk enough about. It was discussed a little bit in the election campaign, because we saw that the way that foreign lobby groups have an enormous influence over the Liberal Party. And the people who organize immigration consultancies and fly-by-night driving schools and a lot of these other little operations that we're hearing about now, these people have got political connections. And there was a combination of naivete and cynicism on the part of the Liberals over the last decade, where they genuinely thought that, what's the worst that can happen? We'll bring these people in, the local community leaders will be happy, these guys who run these businesses will be happy, they'll vote Liberal. Awesome. They forgot about Canada. And that's the part that I think I'll never forgive them for. And a lot of Canadians aren't going to forgive them for, especially the people who are desperately trying to find a new good life in Canada, who now are having that pathway made more difficult because of the way the Liberals have behaved. And by the way, I should have said, not Nigeria, it's China is the second biggest country. So India is at 40% of the total number, and China is at 10%. So we've got two countries that have got organized lobby groups inside Canada. Both of their governments, by the way, accused with absolute credibility of conducting pretty bad foreign interference operations on Canadian soil. The Indian and Chinese governments just must be sitting back and laughing when they see the way that we've mismanaged this and how we're managing to undermine the best of Canada, that commitment to an open and inclusive country. And we've just, we've wrecked that the last few years. The Canadian consensus on immigration is gone, but the solution to that isn't to pretend that hasn't happened or to blow up the system. It's to build something better.
So
that's what we got to get back to.
I've interviewed some people about our immigration system, and the basic immigration system is actually envied around the world and copied around the world, where the point system for people that are coming in with skills, with education, with capital, etc., is actually thought of as a very positive system, and other countries want to emulate it. The criticism is on foreign students and temporary foreign workers. So it appears that the basic immigration system is okay. It was these two extra parts of the system. Is that your understanding, sir?
Yeah, totally agree, with one caveat, that the refugee system, the asylum system, which also had been working just fine. We certainly had some issues with people who coming in from some countries, particularly Islamic countries, who were quite clearly not living up to the standards of that system. We need to do a better job there to make sure that people who come to Canada respect Canadian values. That's another whole conversation, because we better figure out what Canadian values are as a country sometime pretty soon before those conversations are taken out of our hands. But those programs generally worked. But the problem we're going to have now is that we're seeing a large number of these shady fly-by-night immigration consultancies telling the folks who are now being told that, you're only here for a year, for 8 months, 2 years, whatever it is, you're going to have to go home. And what they're doing is saying, just apply for asylum. So what we're going to do there is we're going to blow up the asylum system, not only in terms of the numbers, which are already growing exponentially, at the same time as Mr. Carney is inexplicably making cuts across the board in government. You can't deal with a backlog if you've got fewer people to process those claims. So the numbers are going up. The numbers of people making unjustified claims is going up. And that's going to both delay real refugees from getting the care they should from our country, and it's going to make Canadians more cynical about every single refugee and asylum seeker who comes here. So that's a third area that's now being poisoned because of the Liberal government's incompetence over the last 10 years or so. Again, the solution to this is not Mr. Carney's to pretend this isn't a problem, not tell Canadians about what's coming next year, and it's certainly not Mr. Poilievre's just to say, let's axe all of this. It's to fix and reform. And we can do that by just telling Canadians that we're going to radically reduce the numbers until we can get the system under control. Get it down to 200,000 for the temporary student and workers programs. Let's work with the provinces to develop proper immigration targets, something we still don't do. When I was a cabinet minister here in New Brunswick, by the way, the weird backdrop here is I'm sitting at the Woodstock Airport in rural New Brunswick, and where I have a little ultralight airplane that I'm hopefully going to fly later on. So we've got, as a minister, we had these problems where the feds just were saying, well, no, you just can't have the people you want. So that doesn't make any sense. Some provinces need more immigrants at a time when others need less. We're a big country. Surely that's something, as we're now talking a little bit about the notwithstanding clause and how we handle constitutional reform, that's something we can work on, getting the provinces the people they need. Then we've got to also make sure that no single country makes up absolute maximum 20% of the total numbers, because that also has an effect that it changes the literal look and feel of Canadian communities nearly overnight, which is the sort of thing that makes people concerned and upset. Whether those concerns are valid or not, they are real. Human beings react that way to change. Pretending we're not human and don't react that way is never good policy. And the Liberals tend far too much in that direction, thinking, oh, well, we can just manage this stuff through policy. Human beings are still human beings. Let's at the same time not play on the worst of us. Let's not play on the worst prejudices that often come up when we're confronted with change and with new folks and new groups of people. Let's work to define what Canada is and make Canada a welcoming place with a sane and well-run immigration system that starts off with opportunities for Canadians who are here and then offers opportunities to those who are coming because we need them, and for that small number because they need help fleeing persecution from anywhere in the world.
Is there a right number for immigration or a percentage? I was at a conference in the United States recently, and they talked about how immigration in the United States had typically, both legal and illegal, had been about 1 million people. Sometimes had gone up to 2, and that recently had gone to 3 million people. That's for a country 10 times our size. And I understand that we had over 1 million people immigrate for a couple of years during COVID or post-COVID into Canada, so that we're getting 5 to 10 times the per capita immigration into Canada than the United States. And we've seen the challenges of immigration in the United States. So is there a right number that you think should be targeted for annual immigration into Canada?
Well, the first thing is that we've got to divide that number up a bit, because a lot of those numbers are not from immigrants. They're people who are here temporarily. And so that's one of the huge problems, is that we've got this huge increase in numbers, but they're folks who aren't able to build a commitment to Canada because they're not allowed to stay here long term. So that's one of the first big obstacles. But as I was saying, I think that right now, getting our immigration numbers annually down to 200,000 for the temporary foreign worker and student permits, that would be a good start. Those making sure we have those restrictions in terms of national origin, also a good start. And we can also focus it a bit more. We've really fallen into the trap of allowing folks as well to stay here based on having a master's degree. That doesn't make any sense. Nearly everyone has a master's degree these days. If you want to get one, restricting some of those higher education criteria to folks with PhDs and above, let's do that. And a little note here, you were mentioning being in the States. Glad you got back okay. Let's open the doors to the hundreds of thousands of Americans or non-Americans currently in the US who have just the last couple of days found out they're going to have to pay $100,000 for an H-1B visa. Let's get those researchers, scientists, medical experts, doctors, engineers, all the skilled trades that we need. There's thousands of folks in the States right now are looking at going to the States, reconsidering their plans. Let's make Canada a welcoming place for them to help make life better for Canadians, fill the gaps in our healthcare system and in the skilled trades, some other areas where we've got huge deficits. So I think it's the overall numbers are absolutely critical, but we've got to look at the numbers within that. What does Canada need from the rest of the world? And that's how we've got to start looking at this, that rather than it just being number X or Y, is what does Canada need and what do we need to do to get those folks here? In addition to that small percentage, which is always going to be our responsibility for taking care of the most oppressed and vulnerable, which has always been part of what's made Canada great. And those folks have, by and large, made enormous contributions to Canada, and that's something we should be proud of.
We're chatting tonight with Dominic Cardy. He is the leader of the Canadian Future Party. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes. I'm going to ask him a little bit about why this new party and what it stands for, and a little bit more about how he thinks we got to define what Canada's all about. Stay with us, everyone. Back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Dominic Cardy with me tonight. He is the leader of the Canadian Future Party. It's a brand new party that's been launched in Canada. Why? Dominic Cardy, why are you the leader of a brand new party? I think that you were at one point in time centre-right Conservatives, and then you were centre-right Canadians, and now you're the Canadian Future Party. Why do you think we need a new party? And I think that what you've described is it's a party of the center, the radical center. Why do you think we need a new party of the radical center, sir?
The discussion we were just having around immigration sums it all up. That right now we've got a kind of comfortable small L liberal, large L liberal, center leftish elite in the country who I don't think they're because they're bad people, but I genuinely don't think that they understand the state that the country is in or the challenge that the world is facing right now. And on the other hand, we've got an increasingly populist conservative party that seems more interested in trying to figure out how it can keep its MAGA base under control and appear to be moderate and reasonable to Canadians. And we see that with immigration. On the immigration file again, the Carney Liberals, it's kind of fine. What's the problem? If you talk about this, you're racist. It's nonsense. The conservative approach, even more irresponsible, talking about how they're going to cancel these programs, which again are going to empty our hospitals, leave our fields unharvested, and cause massive damage to our economy, all out of some populist principle. So my point is that what we need right now is a new ideology, not based on bigger or smaller government, but on traditional, and I would say Western, because these are where these ideas first developed as a political force, not because they are limited to people from or of the West, but of Western civilization, freedom of speech, rule of law, regular elections, competitive politics accessible to all citizens. Those are the things that have made this country an astonishing place that's been a beacon to the world for a long time, and similar democracies have been in a similar position. So we need that commitment to some of the best of our past, but going forward, rather than, again, looking at, is this going to make government bigger or smaller, taxes higher or lower, looking at evidence. What is our goal? How do we get there? How do we measure that? And I think if you start doing that, a whole lot of tricky ideological questions that have ripped the left and the right apart and driven them off both sides into corners that are increasingly inexplicable to the average voter, we can instead end up with policies that make sense. Just talking about immigration, my party was the only party in the 2025 election, which we didn't try and seriously contest. We had 19 candidates. We'd only been founded a few weeks before. We ran some candidates to basically test our processes, which is fine. But we did put out a platform, which is available on our website, canadianfutureparty.ca. If you go there, you can see a platform that covers a lot of things that amazingly are now dominating liberal and conservative talking points over the last few months. They dodged those issues during the election. Top of that list, national defense. Not a single party in the Canadian election, except for the Canadian Future Party, committed to increasing our defense spending as a total of GDP to 2% immediately. My party was the only one, a little tiny party with a few thousand members and 19 candidates. What do we see 3 months later? Everyone embraces what we had said during the election, which is we're going to have to go to 5% of GDP in a couple of years. And that's now government policy, and the Conservatives want to talk about it. The Liberals don't want to talk about it much either. They were pushed, I had no illusions they were pushed by me or my party. They were pushed by our allies in NATO. And they were pushed because we have to get ready to stand up to the Russians, to the Chinese, to the Iranians, to the other bad actors who are already beginning a global conflict. The Liberals and Conservatives are being dishonest with Canadians by not preparing us for what's to come. On immigration, about nonsense about shutting down programs or leaving them the same, when the reality is that next year we're going to be facing how Canada handles a necessary wave of deportations and restrictions on immigration unlike anything we've seen recently. And doing that while preserving an open and free society that welcomes newcomers, both because that's part of our values and a reflection of them, and because we need them for our economy. So until we can start to have honest, evidence-based conversations about the fact the world is heading to war, Canada is totally unprepared. Our major parties have not let Canadians be part of the conversation about how they can help us get ready. We had Mr. Carney, who for a few brief months, and I think that's part of the reason he won the election, said a little bit of what we wanted to hear our political leaders say, of elbows up, let's get ready to deal with this changed world. The last few weeks, elbows are back down. Mr. Carney, Mr. was on next message. What we need is a party that, again, is committed to our values, and our values are that you don't coddle nascent authoritarians or established ones, that you push back, that you say that democratic norms and standards have to be the preconditions for free trade deals, that you don't be bullied by countries that try and use their superior size or economic might to, as in the case of the Americans, threaten the independence of our country. We make it clear that we stand 100% for independence, reject any attempts to undermine our sovereignty. And to take a concrete example, which again, no party has others than mine has suggested, anytime any American politician or representative of the US government refers to the 51st state, calls our prime minister a governor, or in any way suggests that our sovereignty is up for question, that a diplomat from the US diplomatic service in Canada, there are hundreds of them, one of them be kicked out. It's about connecting evidence and action. And we've seen very little evidence used for decision-making in recent years, very little action, and occasionally some positive rhetoric in the last few months from Mr. Carney. We don't have time for rhetoric anymore. We need a more radical option that recognizes our institutions are breaking. They're not broken, and Canada is not broken. But unless we recognize that our systems need change, they are going to fail. So right now we have the left and the right both driving us in the same direction towards institutional failure and towards division and disunity. And we need a more positive, unifying message, which I think has to be around, let's use evidence to make decisions. Pretty hard to argue against that. And it's a great way as a politician to direct and guide yourself, because I've had lots of things that I thought were true. And when you look at the evidence, they're not true. And one of the things that's great about being in a party with like-minded, evidence-based people is that when we come across those things, we go, you know what? We were wrong. And then we move on. And I don't hear too many politicians saying they were wrong these days. We need more humility, more admission of error, and a bolder, clearer plan for the future of the country.
Some pretty profound things that you've said. So let me probe you, if I could, on some of them. You said the world is heading to war a couple minutes ago. Do you really believe that?
I don't just believe it, it is happening. Russia has invaded Europe. Russia has invaded Europe with the backing of Cuban, North Korean troops, with mercenaries from around the world who also are creating damage and destruction across sub-Saharan Africa. We have China, which has a fleet of invasion barges specifically built, deployed along the Taiwan Strait, ready for what China says, this isn't me saying it, what China says will be the conclusion of the reunification of Taiwan, which has never been part of communist China, but that's another matter, in the next couple of years. China has said they have entered into an existential fight with the Western democracies, that their aim is to replace our system, the one based on democracy, the rule of law and human rights, with their version of communism and capitalism mixed with the worst elements of both. So this is what they're saying. We have seen in this week 2 uses of Article 4 by NATO's charter by 2 European countries who have suffered incursions into their airspace by Russian jets. When the Turks had 1 Russian jet, and the Turks are kind of friendly with Putin half the time, the Turks had 1 Russian jet fly into their airspace and it was shot down within, I think it was 12 seconds. We've had Russian jets cruising over a conflict zone near Ukraine into Allied airspace and being allowed to loiter there for 12 minutes with no consequence except possibly a very stern letter. The West is not fighting the war, but the war has begun. We saw attacks on security infrastructure just this morning. Cyber attacks almost certainly coming from Russia. We see millions and millions of dollars being spent, and this is all stuff that is known. None of this is my theorizing or joining dots. This is absolutely known. Russians, Chinese, and Iranians in particular, spending tens of millions of dollars to influence online communications. A lot of the fighting over Charlie Kirk the last week or so is driven by the 60-odd% of accounts on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, that are bots. So this is a war that has begun that's not being fought in the traditional way. We're not seeing mass troops rolling into Western Europe yet. But what we are seeing is softening up operations. And that's the reason why you're seeing countries that were until very recently as pacifist as modern Germany saying the war is coming. So our European allies are also saying this. So if all of our allies are saying it, which is increasingly the case, and many of them are introducing conscription and enlistment and increasing their cases just by enormous amounts, if they're all saying that, if we can see the lunacy that's gripping our southern neighbor, where unfortunately the policy goals of the Kremlin are now being reflected in the policy goals of the White House, if we can see all of these things and still somehow think that Canada is going to be left alone in this world of turmoil, we are deluding ourselves. We're a country that was based on and made rich by the alliance of free countries sharing the wealth. That wealth is no longer going to be shared for the next few years. Europe is going to be preoccupied with its own defense. The US may well be preoccupied with helping undermine the defense of democracies, given the active assault on democratic institutions by the Trump administration. This is what is happening. And we have politicians who are literally talking about the upcoming budget in terms of how big tax cuts are going to be. This is nonsense. This is not a time for tax cuts. This is a time for us to spend the money we need to preserve our democracy at home and abroad. And until we start reshaping the political conversation in that direction, until our major parties embrace those messages, that is why the Canadian Future Party, I think, is an essential part of the Canadian political landscape. And I'm going to be yelling as loud as I can over the course of the coming months to try and wake up our political leaders and ask other Canadians to join me in putting pressure on those politicians to say enough is enough. The world has changed. Mr. Carney has said that, but now that's got to turn into something other than liberal rhetoric. We need a plan and we need action and we need Canadians to be involved in this conversation, because so far we are being kept in the dark and we are being misled by both of our major party leaders who don't want to talk about this because neither of them have a plan.
So what's your plan for national defense? Should we go to 3%, 5% right away? Where would you spend the money? Is it going to be on drones? Is it going to be on soldiers? Is it going to be on stuff in the Arctic? What would you be recommending, sir?
So one of the big things is that a party that tries to make its decisions based on evidence is I am not a military man. I've got lots of experience working in conflict and post-conflict zones, ironically working for an American organization when I was doing that a number of years ago. But in terms of the specifics, what we need politicians to do is to set the broad direction. So first, 5% is what NATO is saying we need. That was obvious back in the election campaign, and it's why my party was the only party to campaign on 5% spending on defense in the 2025 campaign. The other parties promised to spend that money on all kinds of other things. They now can't do that. We think it's better to be honest with Canadians up front. So in terms of some of those priorities, it's very clear from a political perspective that it is appropriate for our political leaders to say, we need to look at new technologies. Ukraine has changed the rules of war. The main battle tanks and other heavy pieces of equipment that were seen as being the battle-determining, war-determining factors in 2022, they're absolutely still critical. And Canadians' support there by sending Leopard tanks and other munitions and weapon systems has been hugely valued by the Ukrainians. But it's been $400 Mavic drones that have been modified to drop grenades that have now evolved into some of these large units capable of dropping quite large munitions across hundreds of kilometers. I'm sitting here in a little, again, ultralight airplane that was built in Hungary. The equivalents of these airplanes that are built in Ukraine by a company called Aeropract have been modified to be turned into flying bombs. This plane costs $60,000, $70,000. a missile that would be an equivalent in terms of the explosives it could carry would cost millions and millions. So Ukraine is offering us all kinds of ways to take our strength as a country, a middle power, smallish population, but good research and development capacity, and a culture of innovation. Let's work with them to be the test bed far from the current front lines to help them with developing all the new tech that they need to beat Russia. Something else you asked, like what we can do as a country, let's start defining what our foreign policy goals are. And beating Russia needs to be high on that list. We have been far too slow to talk about, well, let's try and help Ukraine survive, da, 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 da. We need to be talking about how we beat the dictators. And in the West, we beat them with our superior innovation, research and development, and all of the strengths of Western free societies as they've shown them over the last couple of hundred years. So let's get those high-value visa holders from the US here. Let's ramp up our own domestic defense industry. As we're doing that, let's make sure we can defend ourselves over the next couple of years by buying whatever gear we need from other reliable democracies. That means not buying from the United States. I know that's still controversial in some quarters. I know we've paid for a handful of F-35 fighters, but we should not be continuing to purchase weapons from a country that does not guarantee us the unfettered use of those weapon systems. The Americans do not offer that guarantee. We can no longer trust that the US and our foreign policy priorities are aligned based on the clear evidence provided by the Trump administration since his inauguration to his second term in January. So let's make decisions based on evidence. And the evidence is that the US is not right now a reliable partner. I hope to God they return to that status as quickly as possible. But until and unless they do, let's buy elsewhere and let's work with other democratic partnerships to build up our defense sector so that we can become what the US was in the Second World War, an arsenal of democracy, a vast space with a creative, intelligent, hardworking population ready to do the work to help defend democracy, not just here, but around the world, because we don't defend it around the world. They're coming for us.
Cancel the F-35s, don't participate in the Golden Dome, get rid of NORAD. What are you suggesting, sir?
Well, what NORAD is supposed to protect us against the Russians. Today, the U.S. administration has announced they are suspending a significant percentage of the U.S. military assistance for countries bordering Russia and Europe. The U.S. is not a reliable ally right now. I have no issue with NORAD continuing. I do have an issue with us spending money on weapon systems we can't buy. So let's take the ones that we've already bought, if we ever get them delivered. But then let's look elsewhere for the next options for building up our Air Force. And to your earlier point, let's look at ways that we can buy more with less by investing in drones and other unarmed or unmanned technologies, which are accelerating in their development at an incredibly rapid pace. The Chinese are developing them at a rapid pace. So are the Ukrainians. Let's join the ranks of countries taking the lead in that world. And another thing we can do, which is sadly linked to the US, let's talk about our civil defense. Ukraine was able to protect itself from full-scale invasion in 2022 because their municipal governments, their local administrative structures, the Ukrainian population were ready to take up arms if they had to. Canada has no structured civil defense forces. We need those not just to take the burden off our military for dealing with forest fires and floods and the other issues that regularly are happening and often end up by taking up the resources of our military, who should be dedicating their time to war fighting, preparing to defend our country. So let's build up our civil defense capacity, both to engage Canadians in an important national project of defending our defense, and also to take the burden off of our military. And third benefit of us, a group of Canadians who have got some experience working as part of a structured, disciplined, either military or quasi-military structure, so that if we do need to have additional soldiers and folks to defend our sovereignty here or abroad, they're ready to step into that breach. So we got to make, again, these are huge changes, but every single one of them I can justify based on the clear evidence of what our opponents, whether those are the Russians or the Chinese or unreliable allies like the US, or what we hear from Canadians right now, which is that they're spooked. People are afraid. And the only antidote to fear is a plan and clear action. So let's make sure that that plan those actions are developed using the best possible information and with clear national priorities and objectives for Canada defined. I haven't heard that yet because we continue to live in this make-believe world where Mr. Carney and Mr. Poilievre continue to pretend that we're living in some slightly scarier version of the 1990s rather than a new, changed world where democracies are on the back foot, the dictators are on the march, and we are totally unprepared, both militarily and socially, for what is to come. So we started this chat by saying, is there a war coming? The war has started. We're just not fighting back yet. We're still a long way from the front lines, but those things can change quickly. And with the multiple incursions into Europe this week by Russia, the sort of things that 2 weeks ago where people were saying didn't happen and weren't going to happen, we need to recognize that bad things can happen quickly. And if we want to not be surprised, we better start preparing for the worst and getting ready to deal with the astonishing challenges that are to come, which are going to affect our standard of living, are going to decimate our economy, and are going to change the way that we live our everyday lives. And I think the only way in a democracy to do that, to prepare for that, is to be honest with the public and to start talking about what's to come and getting people ready to fight.
Dominic Cardy, we have a sizable deficit. We have a very significant debt. As you mentioned, people are talking about tax cuts. We have an economy that needs some stimulus if we're going to deal with a potential recession that it looks like we're possibly in, and a trade war with the United States that clearly we're in. We're not spending 2% of GDP on defense yet. You're saying it's got to go to 5%? Can we afford that?
No, we can't afford any of the things we need to do right now because of gross incompetence by our major parties over the last number of years. Because these things that we're talking about here today, none of these are enormous surprises. The rise of the autocrats fueled by Western money through incredibly poorly written trade deals where we magically assumed that democracy would spread in places like China if we just gave them enough of our money, rather than them doing what was incredibly obviously going to happen, which is they took our money and used it to build a surveillance state to control their own citizens, and then started to expand their authoritarian power around the world. So we are right now in an incredibly difficult position for a country like Canada and for the Western democracies that since the Second World War have gone through growth and prosperity that's not like anything the world has ever seen, where people like you and I, regular folks, were able to sit here and have a chat looking at pictures of each other beamed across thousands of kilometers, and we just assume that's normal. But the lights go on, that we have power plants that provide us with electricity 24/7, roads that, even though we bitch about the potholes, get us where we need to go. All these freedoms, all these structures. We're so used to thinking about the economy as being the be-all and end-all of politics that we've lost sight that it's politics that protects the economy. If you don't have a structure that can guarantee that people can buy and sell and trade freely, if you don't have security, you don't have an economy. So right now, we don't have security. So I've been on the record since my young days in the NDP as a pretty rabid deficit hawk, saying you should not spend money you don't have, you're leaving a debt for future generations, all those lines we've heard for decades now. But right now, if we don't spend money on our defense and on ensuring that Canada's domestic stability is ensured, more on law and order, but also preserving social programs that make life tolerable for people, we risk a further slide into division and disunity that'll make it harder for us to prepare for the fight that's to come. So this is the first time in my life, and I only say this because of the gross mismanagement that's led us to go into this crisis with the huge debts and deficits that you mentioned. Right now, we have to put our security first. So any decisions that are made have to start with that as the bottom line. Is this helping Canada to preserve its independence, preserve its democracy, and preserve the international order that's allowed us to be the wealthy country that we are? Anything else is a distraction. And that's why I get so enraged at this conversation about tax cuts. There are going to be tax increases. Mr. Carney knows this. He's an economist. He's super smart. Mr. Poilievre, who's also no dummy, he knows this too. And it makes the cynical posturing right now around these budget consultations so depressing. This is not a time to be talking about these across-the-board cuts that Mr. Carney is promoting. That is absolute lunacy. We have some government departments that should be shut down altogether. We have others that need massive amounts of new spending. But what do? We get this mealy mouths around the middle. So, well, let's go a little bit this way, cut 3%, 5%. And then the conservatives saying, well, maybe cut 5 or 7%. This is a time for radical change, because if we don't change what we have right now, it's going to burn down. And rebuilding what we have today in 2025 in Canada, that's not going to, you and I are never going to see the results of that rebuilding process if we let things continue to slide much further. So if we want to save our healthcare system, we need to talk about reform. My party is the first party, I think, in Canada in recent decades to talk about how we need to radically overhaul the healthcare system. A couple of things that more lefty folks would like: national standards, national accreditation. Some things they really don't like, saying that there is right now a private healthcare system in Canada called family doctors, who are nearly entirely small business people. There is no reason that we shouldn't be able to allow medical professionals, not just family doctors, charge the government, so still a single payer system, but have competition for the provision of services. A mixing of private and public under a guaranteed public system that is the model in most countries that have better health outcomes than we do. France, other countries in Europe. So let's look at radical reforms to the institutions we have so we don't lose them, and stop this nonsense of saying that basically it's, let's just leave things exactly the same with a couple of tweaks, or let's just burn it all down because somehow that'll work well. It's time for real plans based on evidence. If we don't move in that direction, we're really risking what's made Canada the greatest country in the history of the world. Despite its recent challenges, I still think most Canadians believe and know how great this country is. And it's up to us to decide if we as citizens are going to use our power, our responsibility to save it. Because that's the other part that makes me nuts, is the modern trend towards politicians using social media to remake themselves a little bit like medieval kings, where they get to beam their messages out to the public. Don't really have to listen to their parties or caucuses anymore. Don't have to listen to people with expertise. They can just try and get the simplest message to the largest number of people with one goal of enhancing their power and authority over their party, over their government. Until we embrace new technology and the ability for all of us as citizens to be able to communicate across the country the way you and I are now, and start to engage Canadians in a political project to get this country back on track, we're going to have a hard time. So that's why I'm going to be spending the next year or so going out and meeting as many Canadians as possible and saying, I want you to join the Canadian Future Party. But what I really want is for you to be engaged in politics and to use evidence to push the party that you prefer to make the right choices. Because until we get democracy back in the hands of people to re-engage them in the process, we really do risk losing this miracle that we're lucky enough to live in today called Canada.
Wow, this is quite the agenda. We're gonna change democracy in Canada. We're gonna increase defense spending from under 2% to 5%. We're gonna change our immigration system. We're gonna get ready for a war that you think is a global war that we're already into. This is quite the agenda. And then you also say that we got to change our attitude toward Donald Trump and the United States. We're going to take a break for some messages, and maybe when we come back, I'm going to ask you about how you would change what we're doing, how we're negotiating, how we're interacting with, how we're living with our neighbor to the south. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes with Dominic Cardy, the leader of the Canadian Future Party. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio. I've got Dominic Cardy, the leader of a brand new political party in Canada called the Canadian Future Party, talking about a whole bunch of stuff. I thought we were going to talk just about immigration, but we've talked about immigration. We've talked about how Mr. Cardy thinks we're in a world war effectively already, and then we've got to ramp up our spending, defense spending, to 5% of GDP right away. We've talked about our economy. We've talked about democracy. We've talked about a lot of issues. And one of the things that you said a couple of minutes ago was that we're not dealing with Donald Trump in the United States the way we should be. And you said that we've got to go back to elbows up. You said that every single time a U.S. politician talks about Canada being the 51st state, or that the prime minister is the governor, that we should kick out a diplomat, one diplomat every single time. At the same time as you're saying that, last week we saw a state dinner in Windsor Castle for the President of the United States. So it would appear that the UK, that France, that other countries are really catering to Donald Trump. So you're suggesting something pretty radically different, sir. What would your strategy be to dealing with Donald Trump if you were the Prime Minister of Canada?
So it would be evidence-based. And the evidence is extremely clear from looking at thousands of years of human history, is that bullies can never be placated by giving them more stuff. Bullies are pushed back by strength. And Donald Trump is a weak man. This is not someone who has a strong ideological vision. He is someone who is desperately looking for approval from those around him and will quickly veer away when he sees that an avenue towards telling people him how great he is, when that's not as productive anymore, he'll switch to something else. So catering to the nonsense that comes out of the US government, which is a disgrace and a betrayal of the incredible democratic history of that country, which is the US has been the shining beacon on the hill for the world, and has been a superpower that has been unparalleled in terms of what it has offered to the world, with all of the limitations and drawbacks that the US has always had. But what we see right now is an abandonment of that role. We're stuck living here. We're next to the US, nothing we can do about that. So what can we do? The first thing we can do, again, is defend our independence and our sovereignty. So it is unacceptable under international law for the president to say the things he has said about annexing us, about the derogatory comments towards the prime minister, all the other issues that have been endlessly chatted about in Canadian media over the last few months. But it's not because those make us mad or they're mean. It's because they're an attack on our sovereignty. That's why they need to be countered. So we've got to exact consequences. The consequences need to be a diplomat gets kicked out every time that's said. That's a low-level thing. It doesn't cost much money, but it makes it clear that we're not going to tolerate this sort of foolishness. In addition to that, we should be looking at how we can move towards a system where the US, the Canadian economy is less dependent on the US economy. We talked in brief about defense and buying the F-35s. Move our defense purchasing away from the Americans. Make it clear why. American businesses will be hurt by that. They will start to suffer. That will reduce their support for a president who's undermining 200 plus years of American legal tradition. Let's go beyond that. Let's talk about how we can also further defend our independence and sovereignty by building up our civil defense capacity in Canada. Far too many Americans who are chatting enthusiastically about the opportunities for the US seizing Greenland, Canada, and Panama talk about how easy it would be. Let's make it a bit harder, and at the same time, make it easier for Canada to defend itself from natural disasters, fires, floods, and have a greater reserve capacity, greater resilience to be able to handle any other sort of crisis that may come towards us. So there are a number of different ways in which we can start to distance ourselves from this administration. And one of the also most important things that we can do is we can speak up, as we have in the case of other countries around the world. Can you just hang on just one sec, Brian? Sorry, just got some noise in the back.
So you were saying?
Yeah. So we can move on all those areas economically, but we can also look from the perspective of human rights and democracy. We spend our time criticizing other countries for behaving badly, repressing the political opposition, introducing censorship. The US government is currently doing that. They are shredding their laws, they are ignoring the Constitution, and we are being silent. And we're being silent because they're big and rich, and we're scared of them. This is foolish. The US is a vast, varied country. Many American states are controlled by either moderate Republicans or Democrats who want nothing to do with this agenda. We need to be building partnerships with Americans who are ready to push back to defend freedom and democracy in the same way that I've been part of American missions that work to build ties with Democrats and civil society actors trying to make their countries better in Asia and Africa. Why have our standards suddenly disappeared when it comes to the United States? So let's start implementing some different standards, and let's start having some about how we enforce them. The problem that we said about NATO tolerating Russian incursions into our airspace. We set rules, and then we argue about why we don't really need to enforce them today, and why let's just talk some more. Until the West starts and Canada starts imposing consequences for bad actions, the bad actions are going to continue. Whether it's the Chinese operating police stations on Canadian soil, something utterly bizarre, which we have heard no updates about from the new government in the last few months, whether it's the US threatening to annex us, whether it's the Russians invading Europe, all of these have come about because of Western and Canadian weakness. So the way to handle past weakness is with current and future strength. So let's define what we mean. Probably not going to be all the things I'm listing, but let's at least have the list that the government wants, and let's stick to that. And let's impose consequences for bad actions, because otherwise we just leave ourselves prey to people like Mr. Trump who do what they want because they get away with it. The only way to stop dictators and bullies is to stop them.
Far stronger recommendations on how to deal with the United States. Fascinating conversation. We're going to take a final break and come back with a quick concluding comment in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio. I've got Dominic Cardy. He is the leader of the Canadian Future Party. Mr. Cardy, you said that in your article that democracies have lost any sense of what their countries stand for. And at the beginning of our conversation, you suggested that Canada doesn't know what it stands for. What do you think Canada stands for? What's your vision, sir?
I think it stands for welcoming people from here and around the world to participate in one of the greatest political experiments in human history, where we inherited an imperial British tradition mixed with French elements, and we built something new, where people from around the world were able to come together and embrace the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of political organization. That package of rights and values that defines Western democracies have been expressed better in Canada than nearly anywhere else. And what we have here in Canada is better than nearly anything else that's ever been seen on the face of this planet. We need to start being clear about what that means. It means tolerance, but not tolerance for intolerance. So it means the right to protest, but not the right for Islamists to crowd in front of a cathedral and block other worshippers from following their faith, or those who want to follow no faith at all. It means the right to contest political ideas openly and vigorously, like we're doing here today, and to do that sometimes with anger and passion, but to the second it crosses into violence or incitement to violence, for the full force of the law to be applied. It means that justice needs to be done quickly and clearly, be seen to be delivered, so that people feel safe in their homes and feel that this is a country where they can invest and build and be confident that their family and their investments are going to be protected. And a place where Canada recognizes that the values that I'm talking about are not values restricted to Canada, but values that are human values, and to do our best to make a world where the dictators are defeated so that they don't keep on coming after us. Because in 1945, we let the Soviets continue, and that's boomerang back to hurt us now. We gave money to the Chinese, that's boomerang back against us. Let's trade with democracies, full, fair, free trade, and let's cut off the dictators so they leave us alone, and that they leave their citizens alone, ultimately, to live the same sort of lives that we want here in Canada, to enjoy ourselves, to hang out at little airports, to go snowmobiling, to play badminton in the summer, to sleep in on a Saturday, not worrying about what the government's going to say to you, to go to work, make your money, and live free. That's what my Canada is about.
Dominic Cardy, leader of the Canadian Future Party, thanks so much for joining us. If people want to check you and or your party out, how do they best do that?
You can just write me an email if you want to leader@thecanadianfutureparty.ca. Go to that website as well. And I always make the practice, even though it drives my staff crazy, you can give me a phone call. You can call me at area code 506-238-5550. I love talking to Canadians about what we can do to make our country better. Let's get on that. My party is obviously how I think we should move this agenda ahead, but let's just talk about how we engage Canadians in politics, save democracy, save our country.
What a fascinating conversation tonight. Thank you so much. We've talked about immigration. We've talked about how our defense spending has got to increase, that Mr. Cardy thinks that we are in a world war effectively already. We've talked about trade, particularly in regards to the United States. We've talked about the lunacy he thinks of talking about tax cuts during this time. And we've talked about his vision for Canada and for democracies. Really quite the extensive agenda. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from New Brunswick, even in a small airport in New Brunswick, at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody. Appreciate it.